families and staff fare better. I want to also thank Kurt Larrick, DHS Communications Director, and last but not least, the Race Equity Advancement Partners team under DHS Director Anita Friedman's leadership for your support in co-hosting this event today. The format of today's presentation will be webinar style, where we will, all the participants' sound will be muted and you don't have to have your cameras on. However, we encourage you to communicate using the chat feature, post questions to Dr. Brown so that she can, engage the audience. We're excited. We have over, I guess, 150 plus people here today. We have many more enrollees that may join and may watch through live stream if we can get that to working. And contact hour certificates will be emailed to each one of you after today's session. Now, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Jessica Brown, who I have found to be an engaging trainer with an exceptional command of knowledge, yet she's easy to listen to and very relatable with a conversational style that will make you pause and think about your professional practice and your personal life. Dr. Jessica Young Brown is a licensed clinical psychologist who serves as an assistant professor of counseling and practical theory at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University. Dr. Brown is also the owner of Choices to Change, LLC, a company which provides therapy services, consultation, and education to organizations on mental health and organizational development. In this capacity, she teaches, conducts program development, and provides consultation in the areas of vocation development, self-care, spiritual formation, leadership, racism, and race-related stress. Dr. Brown completed her undergraduate education at Elon University in Elon, North Carolina. Then she went on to matriculate at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, where she received both a master's and her PhD in counseling psychology. In addition to her work obligations, Dr. Brown is actively engaged at the community level. She is the Varina District Representative for the Henrico County Board of Mental Health and Developmental Services, and she's the president of the Board of Directors for VIP Care, a nonprofit faith-based community counseling agency. She's also an author. She's written the book, Making Space at the Well, Mental Health and the Church, which was published in 2020 by Judson Press. Dr. Brown enjoys consulting with mental health and community organizations on the topics of generational trauma, race-related stress, and issues of diversity and equity, particularly as it relates to striving toward anti-racist practices in mental health organizations. As you can see, Dr. Brown is more than qualified to facilitate this very important conversation that is critical to our work. So I hand it over to you, Dr. Brown.
Thank you so much, Tabitha. I hope I can live up to that glowing introduction there. I can see in the chat that I have some folks who have been to other trainings. So gold stars to you for coming back to deal with my shenanigans again. And I hope that we can have a great time today. I see there are about 200 participants who've logged on. We may have some more people entering. We're recording, it's streaming live. And so the goal is really to get this information out to as many people as possible. As you listen to my bio, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, she teaches at a seminary, she trains at churches, why is she teaching this thing about intergenerational trauma? And so I joke with people that my clinical specialty is Black church folks. That's really kind of where I found my niche in the mental health field. And Black church folks are the people who taught me about intergenerational trauma in African Americans. It was sitting with people, trying to understand family dynamics, trying to understand historical dynamics, trying to make sense of what might seem like these really paradoxical ways of being that drew me to this work. And so I am deeply grateful to the people I serve for teaching me about this and helping me to learn more and become a student of what now for me is such an important part of the way I move through the world, both as a person and a parent, but certainly as an educator, as a clinician, as a trainer. So this stuff I think is really, really, really important. And I hope that by the end of our time together, there will be some part of you that finds it important too. So a note here before we get started is that I have to say that I am standing on the shoulders of a Black social worker named Joy DeGruy Leary. And when I'm teaching this in person, I tell people to pull out their phones, go to their Amazon account, and order her book right now if they don't already have it. It's called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And her name again is Joy DeGruy Leary. She's certainly not the only person who's doing this work anymore, but she was one of the first. And in my humble opinion, she's the best, right? Her work is phenomenal. And she was thinking and writing about these things before all of the other people were. In fact, the first edition of her book was self-published. She's a phenom. If you ever get a chance to read her work, to hear her speak, whatever they're charging and you're thinking that's too much money, it's not too much money, you need her book. What I'll now say, so the name of the book is Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, Joy DeGruy Leary. I'll also say I've been getting really angsty about capitalism and Amazon. And so if I revise that statement, I'll say go to bookshop.org and order the book, because there you can support small local bookstores instead of give Jeff Bezos more money. So I'll say that piece too. Thank you for putting Dr. DeGruy's website in the chat. She's amazing. And so I really am standing on her shoulders with this work and relying heavily on that seminal piece, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. There'll be some other references that we talk about, but if this is all brand new to you, start there. Thank you, Missy. Mahogany Books is Black owned, so that's great. It's her work is so important, and one of the caveats I'll place here is that some of the things that we are talking about will be the things that we as a society actually tend to villainize Black folks for. It is, we're gonna lay out some of the ways that we as a collective culture, even those of us who identify as Black on the call, have blamed Black folks for responding to and interacting with the trauma they've experienced. And so I'm going to invite you to really just have some curiosity about the ways in which we might have all participated in recapitulating this trauma, and the ways that we might still recapitulate this trauma, not intentionally, not because we want to, but because we don't know, right? There's a saying in the Christian church that's connected to scripture, which says, the people perish for the lack of knowledge. And so even if that's not your religious tradition, even if you don't have a religious tradition, or, you know, whatever way you spiritually show up in the world, for me, that's a foundational truth, that in order for us to live and thrive, we have to know the truth. We have to know history. And so this presentation will be about shedding some light on those things. So I'm going to invite you to a place of curiosity. We're going to do some definitions. We're also going to talk specifically about how this dual pandemic, so to speak, of COVID-19, and, you know, people are talking about racism as a pandemic as if it just showed up, which that's not true, right? But there are ways in which in the past year or so, it's become a more talked about part of our national culture. And so we'll also talk about how dealing with those two issues impacts and exacerbates in some ways this generational trauma that we're going to talk about in African Americans. Okay, so I've done enough babbling for the beginning. I will be paying attention to the chat, and let's get started. So let's talk about some definitions first. What is generational trauma? This is a definition that kind of encompasses what lots of different writers have talked about. It is the transmission of traumatic experiences and reactions through active and passive processes. As it is passed down, it becomes ingrained in the psyche and in familial patterns, right? And so this piece is really important because generational trauma basically expands what we often typically think about when we think about trauma. Those of us who are in the mental health field might think about trauma as kind of an individual or even family level phenomenon, right? And the way I explain trauma to my clients in, layman's terms, we have all of our sophisticated clinical definitions. But in layman's terms, I say trauma is something that did happen that shouldn't have happened, or didn't happen that should have happened, right? It's this boundary violation that causes you to feel unsafe. And that lack of safety leads to a full body reaction, right? Our bodies react, our minds react in response to this awareness that safety has been disturbed, right? So that happens on an individual level. It can happen when someone has a car accident, or when there's intimate partner violence, or when there's an assault, or when there's a natural disaster, right? Some types of traumas happen to communities. With generational trauma, what we're talking about really is cultural trauma that has happened to a large group of people who have some kind of cultural connection. And in response to that trauma, the group then begins to exhibit like behaviors in certain ways. Of course, we know that, within group differences are always larger than between group differences, right? So we're going to talk in generalizations with the awareness that not everybody fits the mold. This is a heuristic, not a rule, okay? But what happens is that whole cultural group then is forced to reckon with the trauma. Usually that has occurred because they identify in that particular cultural group, right? And so you might be thinking, okay, well, this has happened to other cultural groups too. Exactly. Black people don't own generational trauma, right? We're just talking about Black folks' generational trauma right now. But you see generational trauma with Holocaust survivors. I would bet in 2 or 3 years, we're going to see literature about generational trauma related to those of us who have lived through the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And so it's anytime a group is forced to deal with the trauma and try to cope with the consequences of that trauma, we see this transmission playing out. A key here is that there are both active and passive processes through which the trauma is transmitted. So a note here, and I'm going to tell you in advance, the biological stuff is not at all my specialty. I'm still unclear how I passed my biological basis of behavior class in graduate school. So I'm going to give you a little snippet here and then lead you to an author who is much more adept than me at explaining the biological processes. But for this moment here, what we'll say is that generational trauma is passed down socially. It's passed down through familial patterns. It's also passed down biologically, right? And there are a couple of pathways by which that happens. What we know now, right, is that trauma changes the brain. So when someone experiences a trauma, their brain changes in response to that trauma, and they behave differently after the fact, right? There's also some evidence to suggest that trauma gets passed down through DNA. And the way that happens is through the female reproductive system. Because of the way the female reproductive system works, any woman who is able to bear children, as she's moving through the world, anything that happens to her also happens to the unfertilized eggs, right, that are inside her body. And so changes to her biological system also impact those unborn children who can then become children, right? And so what that means is generational trauma is not just a thinking phenomenon, and it's not just a feeling phenomenon, but it's a body-based biological phenomenon. And it means we've got to engage all of those resources in order to, one, understand what's happening with generational trauma, but two, in order to begin the process of healing or recovery from generational trauma. Okay, so when we talk about African Americans, with the vast majority of folks who identify as African American living in this country, and certainly in other countries as well, they are the descendants of people who were brought to this hemisphere as a result of chattel slavery. And so DeGruy lays out this really sophisticated historical argument, right, about how slavery changed and in some ways framed the way Black folks have existed in the Americas. So there is the trauma of being ripped from your home, being placed in this boat where people died while you were on this long journey to who knows where. You get there, surviving by the skin of your teeth, and then what you're faced with is a period of servitude that lasts for hundreds of years, right? Hundreds of years. Then the period of servitude is quote unquote over, right? The 13th Amendment frees you. You live in a country where there is actually a stated period of time where the goal is equality, right? And certainly in the South in active ways, in the North in more passive or passive aggressive ways, I should say, the response to the Reconstruction period, where the intentional goal was to try to create equality, was the origination of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Or laws that try to disenfranchise people. Everywhere from voting to redlining, as you know, as a result of the Great Migration, when people say, okay, the South is really bad, let me see if I can move north. My grandparents were a classic example of that, moved from rural Virginia up to Washington, D.C. for, quote, good government jobs, right? And what happened in cities where Black folks were becoming upwardly mobile is people decided, we don't want those Black folks living in our neighborhoods. And now it's hard to get a mortgage for a Black family, despite whether they have money or not, right? So we have redlining practices, we have school inequities. And so it's important to keep in mind, and there are folks who will say, slavery was over a long time ago. Why do people still talk about this? Why are you pulling the race card? You're race baiting. Why do you have this issue? The very definition of systemic or systematic racism, right, is that it's built into the structures that run this country. You might want to ask yourself, might there be an insidious reason why people have to identify race on mortgage applications? You could make the argument, oh, it's just to make sure we have diversity. Well, there have been studies, I think the last one was maybe 2 years ago, that indicated that when people stated that they graduated from an historically Black college or university on their mortgage applications with the same financial qualifications, with the same credit scores, with the same debt to income ratios, they were less likely to have mortgages approved. We've known for years and years that when people apply to jobs and have literally the same resume, and the only thing that changes is the name, folks with, quote, ethnic sounding names are less likely to get the job, right? And so it would be simple if we could talk about generational trauma as this horrible, discrete period of time in the US that was over in 1865, but that's not the case. What we've also got to reckon with, which is a lot harder, frankly, is that right now, in the present day, the systems that allowed for a country to decide that certain people were more akin to cattle than they were to people still persist. And those systems, though they have become more covert, are not gone. There's no such thing as a post-racial America. It does not exist. And so when I talk about telling the truth, this is the truth we have to reckon with, that the trauma is not over. And so think about those of you who work with trauma from a clinical perspective, our strategies are very different if someone experienced a discrete trauma that is over, right? Then we can say, you know, back then you weren't safe. Now you are safe. Let's talk about how to remind yourself that you're safe. Let's talk about how to make separation between the past and the present. That's not what we're dealing with. What we're dealing with is a person who's experiencing a trauma that is active and present in their lives. And so there is no such thing as a back then. And that's really the behaviors that we're talking about when we talk about generational trauma. Because there's no such thing as back then, there isn't some signal that goes off and says, now you're safe and you don't have to engage in those trauma reactions anymore. So they persist. And that's what we're going to talk about today. When people have experienced a trauma, right, their sense of safety is disturbed and they engage in behaviors with the goal of protecting themselves. They do things to try to maintain or restore the sense of safety that was disturbed. And so the things that we're going to talk about today are strategies to restore or preserve a sense of safety that was disturbed. What we know and what we allow for is that when people have experienced certain traumas, they sometimes do things that are counterintuitive. But we know, yeah, they're doing that because they're trying to be safe. It's a defense mechanism. It's a protective mechanism. We have all these kinds of words for it. We are good at identifying that on the individual level, but we really struggle with identifying it on a cultural level. And so I want to invite you today, of course, to really think about how these experiences might show up for African Americans, but with all of the people that you work with, think about if there are cultural traumas that their behaviors are giving you information about, but you just haven't identified them as such. Maybe it's not that they're just dysfunctional and they have this raging mental illness. Maybe they are actually behaving appropriately in response to a trauma. I had a supervisor who used to say all the time, he was a committed cusser, so I'll use a little cleaner language than he would say. But he would say, it's not a mental illness if you're depressed in response to a messed up situation. That means you're a functioning human. And so how many times are we actually labeling things as mental illness because we don't understand, when in fact, people are engaging in protective strategies to keep themselves safe? And Missy just said, pathologizing trauma further traumatizes. Yes, because embedded in our language, in this medical model that we use when we diagnose is, even if we don't say it this way, right? We love the person first language, but embedded in our language is, I figured out what's wrong with you. That's what we say to people. We don't mean it that way, but that's what we say. And in fact, this individual, there's actually nothing wrong with them, right? It's a healthy system responding to an unjust environment. And that's a really different frame that I hope if you get nothing else, that sticks with you. What we're seeing are appropriate, adaptive responses to a messed up environment. And when we can hold that frame, we can view people in different ways, in ways that are more sophisticated, more strengths-based, and frankly, have greater capacity to heal. Because, if when I'm drowning, it's probably not the best time to try to teach me how to swim. And so I think we've got to think about what are the environments that people are attempting to cope with and manage, and how can we help them to name the environment as unjust, as unfair, as oppressive, as a pathway for building strategies to cope. So I will step down off my soapbox for right now so I can get through the rest of my slides, and we'll move forward. All right. So I love this quote here, and we're going to kind of ground ourselves in this framework. Vamika Volkan was actually a sociologist who worked with Holocaust survivors, and he wrote a lot about what he called transgenerational trauma that he saw when working with Holocaust survivors and their families. And he describes generational trauma this way: when a whole society has undergone massive trauma, victimized adults may endure guilt and shame for not having protected their children. The byproduct of such trauma is a perennial collective mourning over the loss of group dignity, self-esteem, and identity. The mourning is characterized by conscious and unconscious communications passed down to generations in an attempt to mourn the group's losses and remove the collective sense of victimization. So here's what I'll leave you with here. All trauma reactions have good intentions. They are attempts to mourn, and they are attempts to heal. If from the outside looking in, all we see is the dysfunction, what that means is that we haven't attended to the trauma. These are attempts to heal. They're attempts to be okay. And what we want to do actually is expand people's capacity for healing and coping with the trauma. So we want to add resources, not just take away what they're already doing. Okay, so we've talked about generational trauma. Let's just add this dual pandemic piece real quick. So a year ago now, it's hard to believe, but a year ago now, we had to start reckoning with this unknown, what they were calling the novel coronavirus, right? And very quickly in our country, we saw that Black and Brown people were dying at disproportionate rates of this virus, right? They were saying things like, young, healthy people should be fine. But in Black and Brown communities, young, healthy people were dying. And even people who had these medical risk factors were dying more quickly. People seemed to be contracting the virus more in those communities. And it took a while for us to get to the point where we named health systems as inequitable. What we were doing first, which we love to do in marginalized communities, is blame it on lifestyle choices. Oh, well, those people are obese. Oh, well, those people weren't taking the appropriate health precautions. What we have to do is name the systems as unjust, right? So when we look at communities of color in our country, particularly the Black community, but other communities of color as well, what we see is less access to healthcare. Even when folks have health insurance, they're more likely to be underinsured, which means they might wait a little longer to go to the doctor. Folks were in those communities were more likely to be employed in positions where they couldn't work from home, they couldn't take paid time off, right? And so the choice many people were left with was between protecting themselves or providing for their families. And that, frankly, is it's an unjust choice to have to make, right? So people went to work because they needed to go to work, but going to work exposed them. And so they were at greater risk, right? And all of this as we talk about this in the context of the dual pandemic, is because of systemic racism in our country, where Black folks are less likely to have higher educational attainment. They're less likely to have sort of white collar jobs. They're more likely to have debt, even when they do have jobs that require education, such that they might not be able to privilege their health over their ability to work, right? So all of those kinds of things played a role. In addition, because of things like race-related stress, Black folks and folks of color are going to be more susceptible to these kinds of conditions because they are more susceptible to chronic health conditions, period. So hypertension, cardiovascular issues, diabetes, obesity. And it would tie a nice, neat bow on it if we said, all of those things are just because of lifestyle choices. If Black folks would just stop eating fried chicken and stop drinking sweet tea and exercise a little more, they would not have this problem. They would be just as healthy as the rest of the world. That would be cute, and it would be a nice, neat bow. But here's what we know. There's lots of research which gives evidence for the fact that race-related stress negatively impacts the body. It makes people more susceptible to all of these chronic health conditions. And those chronic health conditions then made people more susceptible to not just contracting COVID, but having more serious consequences from COVID. There are multiple intersecting factors here, right? Let's add to that too, that in addition to the health systems themselves being inequitable, even people who have access to healthcare might have a deep mistrust of medical systems. That is historical, and it's also a present day reality. So I'm just going to throw out some quick examples here. Think about Henrietta Lacks, whose cells became the foundation for an exorbitant amount of medical research. And those cells were stolen from her without her knowledge at a subpar hospital where she was basically left to die. A Black woman. Think about folks who participated in the Tuskegee experiment thinking they were getting medical treatment, but instead were being left to die after there was an easy treatment available, penicillin, that could have cured their symptoms. I'm stationed in Richmond, Virginia, right? And many an older Black person in Richmond will tell you about the body snatchers from MCV, right? They had a medical center, they needed cadavers. And literally there are people who would say, don't go out late at night around MCV, because there was this fear, and based in reality, right, that people will get snatched up. Let's come a little more recently. In 2017, I think, there was an article published that surveyed medical students, people who were in medical school in 2017. And some of these medical students believed things like Black people feel less pain than white people do. Black people's pain doesn't need to be medicated in the same way. We know about the maternal mortality crisis, where Black women are more likely to die during childbirth or immediately after childbirth than women of other races. When you control for every possible thing that could explain that, all you're left with is their race. And so again, the trauma is not this discrete thing that was happening. It is happening. And so when we talk about things like vaccine hesitancy, it makes a lot of sense if you understand that context, right? Samantha says, also in the Black community, few deserts, the history of government experimenting with health, receiving less care from doctors than other groups, right? So it's not this thing that happened way back then. It's right now. And so, people are saying, well, you need to go get a vaccine because the vaccine is the way you can. Well, forgive people if they aren't gung-ho about a vaccine when they know history. Catrice, Serena Williams is a perfect example. Serena Williams wrote a piece about her experience having her child, and she talked about all of the times that doctors didn't listen to her when she said something was wrong. I mean, my experience thankfully it wasn't life-threatening, but with both of my children, during childbirth, I had experiences where I was trying to communicate to a medical provider about something that I knew was happening. And in both cases, they said, well, no, Ms. Brown, don't worry about it. Here's what we're going to do, right? Medical trauma, right? And so I elected to get the COVID vaccine for lots of different reasons. And I can't tell you how many people, I decided to share it on social media. And I can't tell you how many people called me or sent me a text or were checking on me for days after I had the vaccine and still now saying, are you okay? Are you having any symptoms? How do you feel? People are scared. And that's what trauma does to us, right? It frightens us. It induces this fear reaction. Takia, I just want you to know that I see your comment. I'm not going to say it out loud because I don't know if you want it to be said out loud, but I see you. I understand, and I encourage you to have a support person with you who can help you to advocate for yourself. Daniela says, in the Hispanic community, women are about to give birth, feel that nurses are very rude to them, right? So again, it's a systemic issue, and it's not just Black folks. In this country, there are people for whom the world we live in feels as if it was not made for us. And in fact, this world might be out to get us, might be thrilled at our demise. That sounds hyperbolic, I know, but it's really not. It's really not, right? And then let's add on to the health piece. How many times we've watched videos of people of color dying for what seems like no reason, right? This 8-minute clip of a police officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck. And we won't even get into the arguments about whether that police officer was justified, right? Because that's a whole other trigger. But here's what I know. There is no world in which it's healthy for us to continually bear witness on a 24-hour news cycle to someone breathing their last breath. And so add to the trauma of just moving through the world as a person of color, particularly a Black person in the US, you now see someone who looks like you, who you can identify with, dying in front of you. And because of the 24-hour news cycle, because of the way social media is right now, you see it playing over and over and over again. That's vicarious trauma, right? Watching the video of Ahmaud Arbery just moving around and knowing that by the end of that day, he was dead is a trauma, right? Seeing Breonna Taylor's tweets about what she wanted to do with her life and knowing that somehow she ends up dead in her bed is a trauma. And it's not the kind of thing that you can just ignore, right? But the other piece that happens when these things are available for public consumption is that now there's this invalidating cultural conversation that happens, right? Whenever a Black man or man of color gets killed by police, there are always going to be folks in the comments, right, in the social media comments, who are explaining all the reasons why that person deserved to be dead. Inevitably. People, the social media legislation of the value of a life is traumatizing and disorienting. right? We, since the last time I did this presentation on January 6th, there was an insurrection at the Capitol of the United States. And the conversations that happened after that betray, one, how racist many of the people in our circles are, and two, how divided our country is, right? This whole, these terms, white terrorism and white supremacy, that get thrown around in the media now, frankly, without much nuanced conversation about them. And to hear people deny that race is a part of what's going on in our country is gaslighting. It's just gaslighting, right? Suzanne says, how much do you think that the lack of representation among physicians impacts this, especially given research showing that having a Black doctor decreases risk by half? I certainly think that, so what happens, right, is systemic oppression that gets played out financially and in educational systems then impacts the people who are in power, right? So physicians, mental health providers, teachers, all those kinds of things. And so I think that's a big piece of it. And that's why, you've heard this catchphrase, representation matters. It certainly matters. But here's what I'll say. Some of the Black folks on the call are familiar with the term, all skin folk ain't kin folk, right? And what this means is it's not just about having representation of a person of color, right? It's also about having people who understand the systems that are currently operating. And people of color are simply more likely to have had conversations about this because they have to deal with it on a daily basis. And there's this piece of connection and comfort that happens when you see somebody who looks like you, right? But if it's a person who is a token, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, who just like has a face that looks like diversity, but hasn't done any work around understanding and integrating diversity issues, then that's not particularly helpful, right? So yes, representation matters. And I would say we want the folks of color to be represented appropriately in those systems. And we want everybody to be able to have the conversations, right? Leonardo says the denial is one of the biggest driving forces of ignorance. Vanessa says watching Black death televised and then having victims defamed was the hardest part of 2020. It was exhausting for me. A couple of times, I just had to kind of take a break from social media because it's the script, right? There's video. The police come out and empathize with the person who was the aggressor and say they're doing an investigation. Then the social media trolls come in and they pull videos and text messages from 10 years ago where one time the person had a cuss word or they smoked weed or what, there's this vicious campaign to paint a dead person as a monster. And I think we've got to reckon with what is it about our country that is more invested in villainizing a dead person than holding accountable the person who killed them. We've got to reckon with that. And when we try to make it not about race, as Leonardo said, we're engaging in denial, right? And even the piece here that I think is important to keep in mind is that it's not as simple as white aggressor, victim of color, right? It is people who buy into and participate in a white supremacist framework who are in power, right? It is the people who yell, but what about Black on Black violence, which isn't a thing, by the way, right? That rather than reckoning with people who cause harm. Yeah, the man in Atlanta and the police said he was having a bad day. Guess what would happen if I had a bad day and shot some people? I would get shot. Plain and simple. I have no doubt about that. If I walked into a salon and I was having a bad day and I pulled a trigger, there wouldn't be a story about me being taken away to a jail. There will be reporting that I was killed in a gunfight with police. If I stormed the US Capitol building and sat at Nancy Pelosi's desk and put my feet up, I wouldn't have been able to get on a plane and go back home. Genesis says it's like there's a double standard. Funny thing, right? And I'm being playful because sometimes that helps us to deal with hard stuff. But this is what we have to talk about when we talk about truth telling, right? What Black folks knew in our bones as we were watching the news on January 6th is couldn't have been us. And I could laugh about it because I was safe in my home and because I actually wouldn't think to overthrow the government, even though I might have reason to, right? We knew instantly if that had been us. A couple of years ago, do you all remember the incident of the woman who got turned around the Capitol building? She had her infant, or like a toddler child in the car, and she was killed because they thought she was breaching the Capitol. One lady in a car. So this is the reality that people are reckoning with. And I want to invite us to kind of check in with our bodies right now, because as I'm talking about it, I can feel the physiological reactivity like rising up in me as I'm talking about it, right? And some of you might be feeling that too. You might be feeling your heart racing a little bit. Your hands might be kind of clammy, right? More adrenaline. And what's happening right now? Our bodies are sending us a message. Ooh, something isn't safe. We are not okay. Now imagine walking around with that all the time because your race is ever present. And at any point in time, your race can be weaponized against you. That's what we're talking about when we talk about race-related stress, when we talk about generational trauma. And so if I feel it when I'm in a position of power teaching a class via Zoom, yes, that impacts my parenting. Yes, it impacts my mental health status. Yes, it impacts the way I show up at work. I'm in a position of power right now. And guess what? I'm getting paid for this. And still, my body tells me, you are not safe. Right? So when this happens over time, when it happens every day, yes, chronic stress negatively impacts your body. It's why my 34-year-old husband, who has been an athlete his whole life, who bikes 10 or 15 miles 3 times a week, who's of average height and weight, is on a medication for hypertension. Why? It's genetic. And he's a Black man. So he carries stress with him everywhere he goes. He knows that at any moment, his safety status can be jeopardized. It's not just, people make poor decisions and then, no. That's gaslighting. It's victim blaming. When your body has to reckon with perilous safety at any given moment, it impacts your health status. It impacts the way you parent. It impacts the way you interact with people who you love. This is why we've got to tell the truth. Okay? So let's try to take a minute and just kind of get back in our bodies. Breathe a little bit. Take a big belly breath. So imagine your belly's a balloon and you're trying to blow it up with air. Breathe in through your nose, push the air all the way down to your belly, blow it up like a balloon, hold it as long as you can. And then let the breath out in a whoosh through your mouth. And you can do that a couple more times just to kind of ground yourself back in your body, right? We're talking about a hard truth, but in this particular moment, as we look at our computers, as we sit in our offices or wherever we are, we're safe. And so we can sit in that safety for a minute. Okay. So let's talk about some behavior patterns that we see with generational trauma. I'm going to talk about 3 behavior patterns. Those are not all of them. They're just the ones I decided to talk about, right? Go read Dr. DeGruy Leary's book because she's amazing. So we're going to talk about a feeling of persistent lack of safety. We're going to talk about emotional cutoff. And we're going to talk about what I'm calling opportunity deficit. And let's sit with the awareness that all of these behavior patterns are fueled by systemic oppression and disenfranchisement. Okay? I feel like we need another breath. I don't know. I can't see any of you, but maybe I need another breath. So I'm just going to sit for a minute before I move to the next slide. Remind myself that in this moment I'm safe, and use my breath to convince my body that it's okay to calm. Okay. So I don't need to talk about systemic oppression anymore. I think we've tackled that sufficiently. I see a question here that I want to respond to before we move forward. So a comment here: media is powerful to programming the brain. Showing videos of Black people being killed over and over again is repeatedly an issue. Yes, it's horrible. It's traumatizing to our whole country, and Black folks often feel it in a deeper place because we have this innate awareness that it could be us, right? Laura says, can you talk about how this relates to the experience of Black men, whether recent immigrants or descended from slaves, who completely mistrust the criminal justice system and do not comply with requirements for courts? Whew, that's a whole nother presentation, Laura. Here's what I'll say, and please, y'all, please forgive me if I say your name wrong. I think it's really important for names to be correct, and I don't have the opportunity to engage with you. So here's what I think. Imagine if you had the perspective that even if you do all the things right, when you walk into that court system, you won't be heard, your personhood won't be respected, and you'll just get what you get. If that's the frame, there's very little incentive to, quote, do the right thing, because it's not as if doing the right thing can actually save you, right? I mean, my husband wears a shirt and tie to work. He has a master's degree. He lives in a $200,000 house in the suburbs and drives a nice car. But if he gets pulled over, none of that matters. He's just a Black man, right? And so I think even that is what we need to tune into about generational trauma. These rules that some of us have, when the system has worked for me, I then can build this belief system that the people who follow the rules are the people who have a good life, and the people who don't follow the rules are the people who get consequences. But that's not true, because if the people don't follow the rules, but they look a certain way, they don't get consequences. And if the people do follow the rules, but they look a certain way, they do get consequences, right? So this whole idea that good behavior yields good outcomes is a white supremacist framework that doesn't apply to everybody. Now, I'm not saying we should have anarchy, but we've got to reckon with the fact that it's not as simple as if you do the right thing, it will be better for you. It's not that simple. And for many people, their life experiences and this historical cultural reality have led them to the belief doing those things won't do me any good, so I might as well do what I want. And in fact, it's a way that I can resist. Even if it costs me, I can resist being told from the outside in that I must do a certain thing or be a certain way in order to be a functioning and acceptable member of society. So that's what I can say for right now. No, I don't want to see you because I'll get distracted looking at your faces because I'm a mental health practitioner at heart and I want to know people are okay. So I don't need to see you, but thank you for offering. Yes, Lynn says the myth of meritocracy. Tabitha says respectability politics. Danielle says my son's father and I had to explain to our 14-year-old son that although he's 14, he's 6 feet and he would be seen as a grown man. Whew. Y'all, I have a 5-year-old son and we are attempting to raise him as conscious parents. And so that means he has lots of opinions. He views himself as an equal to adults. And that's great, right? But when I tell you, I constantly worry about the moment I get a call from a school administrator telling me about his quote unquote misbehavior. I've been worrying about it since he started talking. It's scary being Black in America. That's what this boils down to. It's scary. When you know that the system is not having your back 100%, you cannot follow the system rules, right? Renata's talking about, one of the jurors said, I feel if people follow the rules, the police, there wouldn't be any issue. I'm sorry for laughing, but we know that's not true. We know that's not true. We know that's not true. And so what we're left with is this persistent lack of safety, right? The world is unsafe. And at any given moment, things could go wrong. And it won't necessarily be because of something that I've done, but it will be because of my stimulus value. It will be because of the way people perceive me. That's scary. It's scary that our teenage Black kids have to reckon with, the girls have to reckon with being over-sexualized. The boys have to reckon with being seen as dangerous monsters, right? Think about Trayvon Martin. So you mean I can't go to the corner store and get some tea and Skittles without dying? Because some guy who had no official power, who was just on a power trip, decided that I looked like I didn't belong there. And he got off. Emmett Till, 14 years old. Somebody decided he looked at somebody wrong, accused him of whistling. Who dies for whistling? And so the world is not safe. So people behave as if the world is not safe. Tamir Rice, 12 years old, playing with a toy gun, dead. The world is not safe. And DeGruy talks about, she paints this image of two kids in a bank with their parents, right? The little white girl is exploring and moving around and doing whatever. The little Black girl is standing still, rigid beside her mother. And she looks up at her mother as if to ask permission to play. And her mother gives her the look. If you're Black, you know, the letters in the look are all capitalized, right? And that look means, don't you dare. Don't you move. And so from the outside looking in, we might say, well, why doesn't the Black parent want their child to explore? Children need to explore. They need to be able to reckon with the world. What the Black mother knows that she might not even say explicitly to her child is that If her child breaks something or interacts with the wrong person, she won't be safe. She might be accused of being an unruly hooligan just for being a child, right? There's a reason that we were told that we could go out to play, but we had to come back by the time the street lights came on. There's a reason that for many Black folks, the sphere of influence and exploration feels smaller. It's not just because Black parents don't want their kids to dream big. It's because Black parents have this awareness that if you get outside of my view, I can't save you. And where does that come from? It comes from the present day reality, but it also comes from a time during slavery where I could look up and somebody decided to sell one of my family members. It comes from a time when my family could have been torn apart with no respect for the bonds between us. Why? Because we weren't people, we were cattle to them, right? And so this trauma reaction seeks to protect. And what we know, right, about bodies that are traumatized is the limbic system goes into overload, right? There's primitive decision-making, and all of that nice prefrontal cortex activity that helps us to plan and organize and dream and make decisions shuts down. So if I'm in the throes of a trauma, I don't have the wherewithal sometimes to think about what in this moment might lead to consequences later on. I don't think about the fact that if I do this now, maybe my kid will grow up thinking that they have to stay small, that they can't explore, that the world is unsafe. How would I have the resources for that when I'm trying to survive, when I'm constantly in survival mode? And so the message that gets sent is the world is not safe. You are not safe unless I have my eyes on you. But the consequences down the road could be keep yourself small. Make sure you are the right kind of Black person. Don't talk too loud. Don't do too much. Don't ruffle too many feathers. Engage in hypervigilance to keep yourself safe. Corey says we learn to put ourselves down. How is your son? That knucklehead ain't up to nothing. In other words, massa, don't take my son. Yes, we're going to talk about that in a minute, Corey, but you got it exactly right. I've caught myself doing it. We just had a parent-teacher conference, and my son he's in like a small private school, and his teacher just loves him. He's a charmer, right? So he really puts it on. He's a great student. He's a great kid. And the teacher she was just gushing about how wonderful he was. And I felt almost like inside my body, I felt this comment, well, I'm glad he's behaving at school because at home. And this was with a Black teacher, right? It was like a gut reaction that I actually don't even believe because I enjoy my son. But generational trauma says somebody from the outside is seeing your child. You must protect him. How do you protect him? You convince that outside person that he's not as good as they think he is. Isn't that messed up? But the intention behind that behavior, right? Remember, all trauma reactions have good intentions. The intention behind that behavior is to protect, right? If he's not that attractive, if he's not that strong, if he's not that smart, maybe I can save him. Dr. Bradley says, master rapes and then leaves the child. Where did the deadbeat dad come from? Exactly, right? We love to villainize Black men, which, by the way, that's also a myth, right? Black men as a cultural group are some of the most active fathers in the country, regardless of whether they are married to their children's mother, but that's a myth. But we love to villainize Black men for this whole deadbeat dad framework, right? And fathers were ripped from their families. In our origins in this country, fathers were ripped from their families. And in fact, we love to villainize Black men so much that we legislated and criminalize them having the audacity to not be currently partnered with their child's other parent. We criminalize people's reproductive practices, especially when they're Black, right? That's the lack of safety that we're talking about. Opportunity deficits. This is what Corey was talking about earlier, right? This idea of we might diminish ourselves in an effort to protect. I know without surveying that all of the Black people on the call, and probably many of the people of color on the call, regardless of Black identity, have heard you have to work twice as hard to get half as far, right? And so the message that sends by accident is because you have to work twice as hard to get half as far, because there are only but so many spots for people like us, we are in competition with the people who look like us. How did that pattern get played out in the context of slavery? Well, you had the house slaves and you had the field slaves. You had overseers who were Black folks charged with managing, corralling, and surveilling other people who looked like them. And they got special status for being snitches. What does that do if not set up competition between people who should be working together? There's a saying in the Black community that is actually a self-deprecating statement. So we villainize our own selves in some ways, right? By saying, Black folks are just like crabs in a barrel, right? We've heard that phrase. The implication is Black folks work against each other instead of working together, right? Crabs in a barrel do that, but crabs in a barrel are about to die, right? They're in survival mode. And so if you're constantly in survival mode, yes, there may come a time when you feel like you have to step on somebody else's head in order to save yourself. But we love talking about the crabs. I want to know who's in charge of the barrel, right? What is the system in place that put us in survival mode? Who's in charge of the barrel? So it's easy to villainize in group competition. It's easy to say, you shouldn't do it that way. So there's a question, who told the crabs they have to step on each other? Well, frankly, nobody, right? But when you're in survival mode, nobody's telling you to do anything. You are responding reflexively, right? There's a reason that people, when they're drowning, often fight the people who are trying to save them. It's counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense. But people who are in survival mode don't make sense. To make sense requires that you can activate your prefrontal cortex, and trauma cuts you off from the part of you that can think and plan and organize and imagine. Tina says Willie Lynch, unfortunately, is still alive and well, right? So, and if people are not familiar with that phrase, I encourage you to just Google Willie Lynch letter, right? There was a strategy, and there's some evidence that suggests that the Willie Lynch letter is actually like there was no actual Willie Lynch, right? So let's say that for the sake of education and clarity, but we can still acknowledge that this like Willie Lynch framework is alive and well, right? There was a strategy behind lynchings because what you did was to punish people publicly for moving out of line, right? And then display their deaths to the other people who you wanted to move into submission. That's a strategy to encourage people to save themselves and forsake others in their community, and to remind them there's consequences if you dare to not follow the rules, right? And so forgive the folks who are engaging with the criminal justice system, who are tired of the old, there's consequences if you don't follow the rules framework. Because what they know is there's consequences if you do follow the rules too, right? Some of you might be familiar with the term tokenism, right? A token is when someone is put into a status. Oh, Tisha says, can we take a breath? Let's do it. Find a comfortable spot in your chair. And remember, you're imagining that your belly's a balloon. Breathe the air in through your nose and just imagine that you're pushing the air all the way down through your body into your belly. Blow that balloon up as big as you can, and then hold the air in the balloon for as long as you can. When you're ready, release the air in a big whoosh through your mouth. Imagine your belly's a balloon. Breathe in through your nose. Imagine you're pushing the air all the way down your body into your belly. And as the air gets pushed, imagine that you're reminding all the parts of your body that are tense that right now, in this moment, even though we're talking about some tricky stuff, you are safe. Tell your breath to convince your body that it's okay to breathe, to live. Hold the air in your belly for as long as you can. And then when you're ready, let the air out in a big whoosh through your mouth. So I want to invite you to do that whenever you need to. This is activating stuff. But right now, as we look at our computers, as we sit in our chairs, we're safe. And we can sit in that safety for now, because when we sit in the safety, it gives us a chance to get curious about and interrogate these trauma reactions rather than enacting them without knowing what we're doing. And that's the goal, to get to a place where we acknowledge that the trauma reactions exist, but we don't have to be ruled by them. They are some of the many options. Kenny says, root yourself in this present moment. Yes, it is 11:19 on Wednesday, March 24th, 2021. And right now, in this moment, we are safe. Someone says, when I was a young man coming up, I never thought I would make it to 25. Because of the crack and AIDS epidemics in the Black community, I lost friends and family members who were murdered and died from overdoses, and some imprisoned. Now, addictions are viewed as a sickness because of those who are being afflicted and those receiving treatment, and not 5 or 10 years in prison. That's, I don't need to comment on that, right? It's the reality that many people are dealing with. The reality that the criminal justice system is not actually about justice and equality, right? That it replicates some of the same systems that we know to exist elsewhere in the world. Joanne says the crabs are not stepping on each other in the barrel as much as they fight to get out of the boiling pot. It's not the barrel that is the issue, it's who controls the heat in the pot. They step on each other to escape, right? And so it's not really about, you know, interdependent, healthy relationships at that point. It's survival. It's survival, right? So let me talk a bit about a token. A token is someone who acts as a stand-in, right? They become the happy representative of all the people of color, or all the people of a certain ability status, or all the people who don't identify as straight, right? But it's a representative in name only, right? They have very little power, and they're often being used to perpetrate a lie about whatever system they become a token in. So for example, I know there's a fellow Elon alum on the call. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that you are white. Why? Because Elon is like 95% white, right? And so when I was there, Elon has this monthly magazine. And let me just say, I had a great experience at Elon. I loved it there. I had a great time there. But it's a predominantly white institution and I was in the minority, right? So in my 4 years there, Elon has this monthly magazine. In my 4 years at Elon, I was on the cover of the Elon magazine 4 times. Now, I think I'm smart. Maybe some people might argue that I'm exceptional, though I think, naming some people as exceptional is a white supremacist framework, right? But there is no way in the world I was so exceptional that I needed to be on the cover of the Elon magazine 4 times in 4 years. There's just no way. That's tokenism. It's a predominantly white system holding up what they see as an exemplar person of color to perpetrate themselves as something that they may or may not be. And let me be clear. I do not think that somebody in marketing at Elon was like, oh, let's find a colored girl that we can put on the magazine. It's insidious. I don't think there were meetings about identifying model Black people and model Asian people that they could tokenize. What I do know is that I was on the cover of the magazine. I do know that I was in admissions brochures. I do know that for 4 years after I graduated, they asked me to come back and come to admissions weekends to talk to people. I'm not that exceptional, but I was a Black girl who was on scholarship, who was a part of a fellows program. I spoke well and they knew I would sell the school, and maybe, just maybe with me there, they could convince other folks of color that the system was more diverse than it actually was. And again, I don't think there were any meetings. Maybe there were some meetings, but I don't think it was malicious, right? But the truth is the token is hurt and the community that the token represents is hurt, because no individual can represent all of the interests and thoughts and feelings of a community. It's just impossible. It's a double-edged sword. So let's talk about emotional devaluation or emotional cutoff. When I was 4 years old, I was in the grocery store with my mother and I wanted some cookies or something. And she told me no. And I fell out. I threw a tantrum. And my mother put her hands on the grocery cart, spun around in the middle of the aisle, and walked away from me as if she didn't know me, as if I was some random child who had just fallen in front of her. And so 4-year-old me very quickly realized, this doesn't work with my mother. And so I get up, I dust myself off. My mom had gone to a completely different aisle, honey. I guess she was keeping an eye on me, but she walked away like she didn't know me. She really did. And so I went and found her and I said, I'm sorry, mommy. And she looks at me and says, are you done? Yes, mommy, I'm done. Right? So tantrums are a normal part of childhood, right? And what we know about, right, Renata, that's when you get the look. What we know about kids is that they are inherently dysregulated. And so conscious parenting says kids are inherently dysregulated. And so we need to co-regulate, right? We need to help them regulate. So these newfangled parents, as my mother-in-law would say, would sit with the child. Listen, I know you're frustrated. I know you're upset. Let's see if we can take some deep breaths. I understand that you're frustrated that you can't get what you want right now. I hear you. And we're not going to be able to fix this situation right now, right? That's co-regulation. You get on their level, you connect before you correct. That's the phrasing, right? But here's the thing. If it was 1817 and your 4-year-old child threw a tantrum when you were supposed to be working, what time would you have to attend to that child? And in fact, if they became too loud or caught someone's attention too much, they could even be in danger. And so the trauma says, cut that off right now. Don't feel. Certainly don't talk about feelings, because your feelings won't help you. Right? My son, he was like 3 and we were on the phone with my mother-in-law and I was trying to get him ready for bed. So I'm like, okay, come on, let's go upstairs. Let's put PJs on. And he says to me, I'm angry about that, mommy. And my mother-in-law's on the phone and she says, oh, y'all some newfangled parents, right? This idea that he could have a feeling about bedtime. Like, I don't care about your feelings. Get up and go, right? Here's the thing. We sometimes forget that children are whole people. And so we see this pattern of emotional cutoff, particularly with kids, which says your feelings are unimportant. Your feelings will not serve you. And so don't feel. Don't feel. That feeling that you're having is inappropriate. Let me give you some other phrases. Fix your face before I fix it for you. Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. I'm already crying, so I don't actually need something to cry about, but thanks for offering, right? All of those messages tell kids whatever you're feeling is not okay, so just stop, just cut it off. And trauma says there's no space for your feelings because your feelings make you unsafe, right? But here's the kicker. That kid then grows up with a history, a sophisticated history of emotional cutoff. And we wonder why they're unable to form healthy romantic partnerships. We wonder why they self-medicate with food and substances. There's no button that we press when we turn 18 that turns on our emotion regulation skills. Let's just get clear about that. Christina says to protect the child with unintended consequences, right? So we act to protect them. We want to protect them. No, Black parents are not out here like, let me think about all the ways I can screw up my kids. No, I think I have to protect you because the world is not going to make space for your emotions. But what I end up doing by accident is teaching my child, and this is the part that hurts, y'all, teaching my child that even our home is not safe. Even our home is not safe. Tabitha just reminded me to say something that I say when I teach this, which is, are we parenting for freedom or for slavery? Right? Parenting for slavery says, I need to teach this child to take up as little space as possible, to not make waves, to just keep your head down and go. Parenting for freedom says, I give you permission to challenge me, to ask questions, to be wrong, to become undone, to explore. Because if nothing else, our home is a place where you can be free. I can't protect you out there, but surely I can resource you in here. Decolonizing Parenting. There's a great website called Parenting Decolonized. The woman's name is Yolanda Williams, who founded it. She has a website and she also has a podcast. There's also, if you're on Facebook, there's a Facebook group specifically for Black parents called Conscious Parenting for the Culture. Right? And so parenting is one of the ways that we resist generational trauma, right? My commitment to my kids is this world might not see you as a human being. This world might not respect your personhood, but at least you will know what it feels like from having been raised in my home. And if nothing else, you now have a litmus test about what's a safe environment and what's not. That's my commitment as a parent. And let me tell you, it's hard. My son is 5 and he is real verbal and real smart. And so he says things sometimes that if I had said those things when I was a child, my block would have got knocked off. It's hard. But what I remind myself of is, what kind of grown-up do I want him to be? And what are the consequences if I stifle his questioning, his exploration, his curiosity? What am I costing him if the message I send is that even in our home, you can't be free? Even in our home, you don't have a full expression of emotion. I'm gonna give you another quick example and then we'll move. Christine, I see your question. I'm going to get to it in a minute, but if I don't respond in a few minutes, please just remind me of that question because I think it's an important one, okay? I'm gonna give you another quick example related to emotional cutoff. If you've had me in a training before, I'm sorry, you've heard this story, but it's classic. So about a year ago now, I guess, maybe more than a year, I had an issue with my car and there was a part that needed to be replaced. And it was Labor Day weekend. I dropped the car off like during Labor Day weekend. And I had been told that it would be ready like on Tuesday. So I call on Tuesday and they say, oh, your car's not ready yet. We have to order a part, but the part's on back order. It might take a while. You know, keep waiting basically. Well, I wait and wait and wait and wait and wait. Had to rent a car because it was a month and some change and they still had my car and they still couldn't give me an ETA on when my car would be ready. And here I am spending money on a rental and paying this car note. So I'm livid. I'm going to go talk to the general manager because I've talked to the service manager. He pissed me off. He didn't have a good answer. So I'm going into the dealership to talk to the general manager of the dealership. I'm on the phone with my line sister and I'm raging. I mean, I'm really mad and I have reason to be mad, right? Because they've had my car now for 6 weeks. They can't give me an answer. I'm raging. And I'm telling her, you know, I'm going to tell him. And we're on the phone and she says, Jess, don't get arrested. And we laughed about it. It was really quick. Jess, don't get arrested. On to the next thing. We laughed. But she was reminding me, don't forget you Black. Don't walk up into that dealership cutting the fool. Because no matter how justified your anger is, you won't be safe if you show up like that. As a Black woman, if you show up like that, the best case is that you don't get what you need. The worst case is that you get arrested real quick. And keep in mind, she didn't have to say all the extra stuff. All she had to say was, don't get arrested. And I knew instantly what she was saying. Don't forget you're Black. Don't forget you don't have all the allowances that other people have. You're not allowed to show up angry, whether it's justified or not, right? And so Black folks live with this constant pressure to make themselves small, to shrink their feelings so as not to offend the sensibilities of the other. We love to celebrate Ruby Bridges, right? We love to celebrate how this little girl steeled herself and walked into a school to integrate it as grown people yelled at her, spit at her, threw things at her. In what world is it normal that a 6-year-old shows no emotions in the face of that kind of violence? We celebrate it, but we don't count the cost. We don't count the cost of being coached during the civil rights era to show no emotion while people pushed you and cursed you and spit at you. That's not normal. What we're saying is, turn off your human part so you can survive. Or better yet, turn off your human part for this higher calling. But when can I turn it back on? And if I learned when I was 6 to turn it off, how do I even have the capacity to turn it back on? Who teaches me to reckon with my own emotions if I can't do it in my home? And so that's why my son can tell me when he's angry or sad about something. Because if I don't help him, how will he learn? But what we expect, Kenny says the training by snake. Yeah, they actually trained. Part of nonviolent protesting was to not respond in the normal human way when people victimized you, when people attacked you. There's no button that you can flip that, okay, now I'm not protesting, so I can reckon with my emotions again. So the very things that helped us to survive now in 2021 can hurt us if we're not helpful. They can make us more susceptible to those diagnostic labels that we love, to substance abuse, right? To engaging in quote unquote antisocial behaviors, right? That's a trauma reaction. It's not just, oh, those people don't have full expression of emotion. Yes, Daniela says ODD and ADHD, right? When I teach abnormal psychology, I tell them ODD should be called trauma reaction. ODD should be called trauma reaction. We want to blame the individual when we have not looked at the system. What's the other one? Reactive attachment disorder, trauma reaction. Personality disorders, trauma reaction. People don't do things, with the exception maybe of people whose reality testing isn't intact or some psychotic disorders. And here are the caveats there. People don't do things unless they're serving a purpose. So if we stop at, oh, this is a dysfunctional behavior, we actually don't help people to heal because we haven't identified what the purpose of that behavior is. 9 times out of 10, it's a trauma reaction and the behavior has good intentions. It's just not appropriate for the situation, right? Okay. So what we're left with, and then we'll get into some things we can do, hold tight, is people are less likely to name trauma as trauma because they've been taught to avoid their internal experiences and move away from them. We also have people who have intense resilience and grit, people who can just seem to kind of get through everything, right? You've heard the strong Black woman syndrome, which let's retire that. Speaking of cancel culture, let's cancel strong Black woman syndrome, right? We have people who have honed in on these powerful, persistent value systems to cope, to survive, right? 15 or 20 years ago, I would say that for Black folks, that's mostly religion. But now Black folks are actually less religious than they have ever been. Even people who are not religious, though, there's often a strong value system that undergirds the way the person moves through the world. And so that's a protective factor, right? A. Easterwood put a comment in the chat that I just want to encourage people to attend to, because I think it really speaks to the choices we make as parents and the power of those choices. The choices we make as teachers, as aunts, as uncles, as community members, right? Those choices have power. There's also this reactivation of trauma narratives in current times. There's this scene in the show Lovecraft Country in HBO. There's the three of the main characters are in a car, and it's set in like Jim Crow era South, right? So the 3 main characters are riding in a car into this town that's like a sundown town, sunset town. If people are familiar with that phrase, basically the idea was you need to get out of that town by sunset because you won't be safe as a Black person. So these 3 Black characters are riding in a car, and the whole scene is they're just driving down this road, and they drive by like a fire station, and there are these white men standing around a pickup truck, and they're just watching them drive down the street. That's the whole scene. And so if you don't have that cultural awareness, it might just look like a scene to you. But I was watching it with my husband, and instantly we looked at each other and said, something about to happen, right? I won't say the words my husband actually said and offend your sensibilities, right? But instantly we knew something bad is going to happen. 3 Black characters just driving down the street. The white men are looking at them. Why is that a sign of danger? Well, because there's a persistent lack of safety, because our bodies have given us information about a threat, and because even in the present day, it's easy to reactivate those trauma narratives because they're present with us. The trauma is not healed. The trauma is not over. And so it's easy for one stimulus to trigger that trauma response, right? Imagine that happening when you're watching TV, when you're watching the news, when you show up at work and your supervisor gives you a compliment, but it's kind of backhanded. Or your coworker insinuates that you don't have as much intelligence as they have. Or you go to your child's parent-teacher conference and the teacher says, he's so articulate, as if it's a surprise. And so that constant physiological reactivity leads to persistent physical and emotional dysregulation unless we make different choices, right? Unless we interrogate those trauma narratives. And so the question we're left with is, what do we do? I have some quick ideas, right? The first thing, and we've talked about this, is we have to tell the truth. We have to recognize and name systemic racism. We have to name that when we apply for a mortgage, when we walk into a bank, when we enter a school, when we go into a doctor's office, the systemic racism meets us there. We have to explore parts of history that have been forgotten or erased. I live in Richmond, Virginia. We have a whole street called Monument Avenue. And with the exception of one lonely bronze statue, all of the statues for years and years on Monument Avenue have been Confederate heroes. Only in this country do the people who lost the war get statues. In Virginia, we were taught that the Civil War was about states' rights. States' rights to own slaves, right? We got to tell the truth. We have to tell the truth. We have to hold systems accountable for their transformation. We have to say, yes, let's have an open conversation about reparations. We have to say, yes, let's talk about how Black folks have been systemically disenfranchised and that voter laws actively seek to help people be stricken from voting rolls. We live in a country where the people who were elected work to have less people vote. We have to call a thing a thing. Christina asked a few minutes ago, what can we do? What can white people do to be allies? You can tell the truth. Because the truth of the matter is the privilege that you hold as a white person allows you to say things that I, as a Black woman, won't be able to say. And so if you want to be an ally, learn your history and tell the truth. You will be in spaces, you will have audiences that some folks will never have. You have implicit permission to say things that I will never be able to say. So what that means, though, is that you've got to do your homework, right? You have to work to educate yourself. Missy says, for the white people on the call, although it's excellent for everyone, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. It's in the reference list. Excellent resource. So people are placing resources in the chat. Check those out. You have to educate yourself. You have to tell the truth, because if we don't tell the truth about what happened, how can we heal? If we continue to use euphemisms and talk around things, what our bodies recognize is that we have not yet made the environment safe for healing, because we haven't even acknowledged that the trauma happened. I recently moved, and one of the things I did when I was driving to the house for the first time is I drove around the neighborhood to see if anybody had Confederate flags in their yard. Why? Because you can make it heritage, not hate all you want to. That's scary to me as a Black person, to live close to somebody that has a Confederate flag in their yard, because I don't know what they think about me, and I don't know if they think I belong in that neighborhood. One of my new neighbors brought me a flower and a card yesterday. And I've lived there about 3 weeks now, right? But I actually let her drop it on my stoop. And then I waited until she was all the way at the street. And then I opened the door and said, thank you. Why? Because I wanted her to see a Black woman from far away first. That's what happens when the world is unsafe. Okay, lots of book recommendations in the chat. Please check those out. And I have a reference list here too that I'll share. So we have to tell the truth. We have to reckon with what happens for people on a daily basis, right? And then once we reckon with that, we have to create sacred spaces for ourselves. It is the breaks that we took in this 2 hours to stop and breathe, to return ourselves to our bodies, to remind us of our safety, right? So it's things like that. And that'll be on the next slide too. But it's also about creating community, right? So for those of us who are parents, creating communities of parents who have like goals. For some of us, that might be a faith community. For some of us, that might be a professional organization or a social organization that has similar values, right? For some of us, that might be engaging in activism to work against some of these systemic issues. From a medical and mental health perspective, finding providers who understand culture, right? So there is no medical provider I have who's not a Black person. And I don't feel any kind of way about it. Not only are they a Black person, but they are a Black person I talk to before I schedule the first appointment. My dentist, my PCP, my OBGYN, right? My therapist, everybody is a Black person with whom I've had a conversation about culture. Because as much as I can, I'm going to avoid going into spaces where I have questions about whether my humanness will be valued. So I'll do the work on the front end to have as many safe spaces as I can for myself. And I'm unapologetic about that. Daryl says, how do we get systems to recognize that this trauma we feel and suffer is real and diagnosable? I think that's a tricky question because the systems were not designed to recognize us as people, right? This is the same country that after they acknowledged that we might be people, would still only concede to 2/3 of a person. That's this country right here, right? And so I think there are a couple of options, right? Some would say that you infiltrate the system, right? You elect a Black senator and a gay senator into Congress, right? You have a woman of color who becomes vice president. You have people who represent the interests of marginalized communities to infiltrate the system, right? That's one way. The other ways might be to beat the door down, not literally as some have done, but figuratively, right? Become the squeaky wheel. And frankly, there are some people for whom their sacred space is divesting from the system altogether, right? So I can't say that there's one right way, but what I'll say is we can listen to the wisdom of our bodies to give us information about what our particular role is, right? So some of us are able to have those conversations with the quote other, and we have the resources to do that. And some of us don't. Some of us know if we have those conversations, we'll end up in jail. And so maybe we're the protesting type, right? I think there's enough space for all of us to kind of live into what works for us. But frankly, some systems need to be overturned and abolished and reworked. And so I think there's space for all of us to do some of that work. We want to attend to the body, right? For the mental health professionals, attend to gut intuition and somatization, right? What symptoms is the body holding? When I'm feeling tense and anxious, I don't want to CBT that away and rationalize it, right? But maybe I say, my body's giving information about being unsafe. Let me look around and see what my body recognizes that I do not, right? I tell my clients all the time, your body's telling on you. Your body is wiser than your mind is because your body has had to protect you when your mind has shut off. And so we can't think ourselves out of this. We have to feel our way out of this. We have to embody the practices. And so for the folks who are a part of marginalized communities on the call, maybe that's building in 5-minute breaks every hour or so to breathe. Maybe that's cultivating practices that care for your body to work to reverse that race-related stress that lives with you on a daily basis. Okay. There was a comment in the chat about insight about how this plays out in Latino communities, and I meant to respond and didn't. That I can't find the chat now, but if you can send me an email, I don't want to pretend to be an expert where I'm not, but if you send me an email, I will send you the name of a person who's doing that work up in your area, right? So what are the spaces you can curate for yourself where you can be safe? Whether that's at work, whether that's in your home environment. We have to find spaces where we can settle ourselves in our chairs, breathe deeply, and remind ourselves that despite what's going on in the world, in this present moment, we are safe. When we can find a place of what I would call internal safety, right? So having that internal safety, then we can reckon with those big questions of when I'm parenting, am I raising this child for freedom or for slavery? When I'm at work, how do I advocate for myself without becoming victim to respectability politics that say I am not allowed to have a voice? How do I help my colleagues to understand when they might have unintentionally microaggressed, right? And we can do that if we care enough for our bodies to help them find places of safety. The final piece is, and DeGruy talks a lot about this in her work, is really reconnecting with culture, right? How do we capitalize on cultural qualities that are protective, that help us to focus on strength and resilience? For some of us, that's reconnecting with Afrocentric frameworks and practices. One of the biggest components of the violence against Black Americans in this country is that slavery disconnected us from our roots, right? For most of us, after 3 or 4 generations at this point, we lose the trail. And that's violence, right? Because history can be a part of what undergirds us. One of the things I like to say is if we believe that there is generational trauma, we also then have to believe in the capacity for generational healing. There's a West African framework called Sankofa. It's represented by this image of a bird that's facing forward but looking back. And the rough translation is go back and fetch it, or go back and get it, right? And so for many of us, the answer to our trauma is Sankofa, is returning to what we were before our safety was disturbed, right? Returning to the essence of who we are. And for some people, thank you, Linda, for putting in the chat, Sankofa. For some people, that might mean actually packing up and going back to the West African country where they have their origins, right? For others, it is thinking about ways we can embody those principles and frameworks, cooperative economics, self-determination, right? It's for some of us, it's celebrating Kwanzaa in addition to Christmas, right? And so there are all these different ways that we can reconnect with culture, but it's about understanding our history and our heritage as bigger and wider and deeper than being descendants of slaves. Yes, we are descendants of slaves, but we're also descendant of people who were not enslaved, right? And all of that is a part of our history, right? We can learn about, there's a comment in the chat about researching African and Black psychology, right? Looking at strength. Tabitha and I were having a conversation about having a strengths-based approach when you talk about the reality of Blackness in this country, right? And so we can interrogate the survival coping. What would it mean to live as if we are free, right? What would it mean to imagine? What would it mean to give ourselves space to dream, to create art, to procreate, to build businesses, to be professionals in an environment that is betting on our failure? That's resistance. That's resistance. And so I know that was a ton of information. Tabitha, what I'll do is email you all these slides so that you can share them, perhaps when we're sharing the completion certificate, so people will have these. I have a couple of pages of references here, and I just want to draw your attention to a couple of them. So I talked about Joy DeGruy Leary, that's here, post-traumatic slave syndrome. I also want to draw your attention to Resmaa Manakem's work. He's also a social worker. My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Healing Our Hearts and Bodies. That's a great place to start because he talks explicitly about the violence that is racism and how it impacts all of us, right? Racism is not just a violence against Black folks or Latinx folks or Asian folks, right? It's also a violence against white people. And so I think he does a great job talking about that. For the parenting aspect of this, I recommend Stacey Patton's work, Spare the Kids, Why Whooping Children Won't Save Black America, right? So I'm hopeful that this gets you started. I'm aware of the time. So yes, I will share the PowerPoint so you all can have access to that. And so my encouragement to you is that if this is your first time encountering this, that you take a look at the reference list and get going, right? Starting to do this work. Other folks are placing resources in the chat. So thank you all for that. I want to thank you all for sticking with me, for breathing with me, for engaging the material. And I think Tabitha's gonna come back and say a final piece. I'm gonna put my email in the chat one more time. Feel free to email me. If you have, other resources you need or things like that. I'm gonna unpin myself, Tabitha, so people can see you. Do you need me to unmute you, or can you unmute yourself, Tabitha? I might need to unmute you. Okay. I did an administrative mute, so we wouldn't have issues. Okay. Go ahead.
I just have to thank you. Every single time I hear you speak, I get something new from the experience. And so by evidence of the chat and the conversations, the resources, people are so impacted by your words, your expertise, how you share the information. This has been incredible. And you've given all of us something to think about, both in our professional and personal life. So I just can't thank you enough. I hope that every person within the sound of our voice has been impacted in some way, and we take this information back to our organizations and to our families to transform and be made better for it. So thank you for your expertise and your openness and willingness to share. And I'm sure we're going to want to hear more from you in the future. So thank you, Dr. Jessica Brown. This has been incredible.
Thank you all so much. I'm glad it was helpful. I'm going to stop.